So we're going to go through the RDL. This is a great exercise to really load the lengthened position of the hamstrings. First thing I'm going to talk about is the position of the pins. Now, if we were looking for a pure RDL like this is a fair position. Just something where it's not too far down, it's not going to fatigue him to get it up, and he can bring it off the rack. If we're looking at a rack pull, where we might go to a bit more erectors and we want to load it a little bit more, we can bring it down to where the end of their active range is, which we'll discuss in a second. Now we've stepped it up, we're going to get into step back, a little bit like the squat. We're going to find that purposeful position here. We want hands just outside of hips, and I want to think about like protecting his armpits. So I'm just trying to bend that bar in half so we can stabilize through the lats. Like we spoke about with the squat, how at the top position here, we don't have any load. The load's just going straight down. At the bottom, it's going to be the biggest challenge. We want the most stability at the bottom. So as he comes into the RDL, I want to think about more and more bending that bar, more and more. So at that bottom, he's really trying with all his might to try and break that bar in half to create as much stability through the spine as possible. And the same thing with the feet, so we can create as much stability through the feet as possible, right? So we're going to come back up to the top. Key things we want to think about here when doing this, we want to keep the hips high. So we want to think about pulling into the hip here, so we can pull his hips as far away from the knees and create as much of a moment arm between the bar and the hips as possible to get that stretch through the hamstrings. In that bottom position now, what a lot of people will start to do is try and throw their upper body up. So just give me a swingy upper body rep. And we'll see here, the head will move first, we'll see a loss of brace in the lower back. What we want to see instead, that brace, rib cage down, pushing out, chin tucked in, and then pulling into that bottom position. Now we're here, I want him to think about pushing the ground down as he comes up. So just do this slowly, like a leg press, and as he passes his knees, he wants to drive the hips in to bring his hips into that equation. That's what we want this to look like. So just come back down to that equation here. Now, a couple of breakdowns we tend to see. First one is going to be the head is going to be lifted up for people to look at themselves. The body will go where the head goes. So not only do we break that sort of neural chain where the nerves are coming through here, but also he's now going to start to do this if the head's up. So get him to tuck down, so now we can lock in a little bit better, we can keep everything locked in a bit more stable. We've already spoke about swinging the upper body back, so if we don't worry about that, come back up for me. The other thing we're going to see happen is people are going to lean forward rather than push back. So we see here, it might look good. If you see what Kev's doing here, he's not losing this at all, but if you notice how the hip hasn't moved, it's not very far away from the knee. So we want to think about here, he's trying to bring the hip away from that bar. So now there's a bit more of a distance. That's what we look for in an actual hip hinge rather than a lean forward. Come back up for me. Another thing we'll often see happens is people trying to keep the knees completely locked. What's going to happen here is he's going to come back and he's going to run out of room at about there. Now he's not locked those knees out again. So now he's got good range here, but at some point he's going to run out of room here and he has to move from somewhere. So either he leans forward and loses his upper back, or he falls over. So you see clients lose that balance. It's going to be one of two things. Either they're not screwing in with their feet and you want to cue them to push their big toe and heel into the ground, or they're keeping their knees too locked and they've run out of room and they just have to go somewhere to keep balance. So what we want to do instead is, if you think here as he comes back, have a soft bend of the knees, almost imagine you're trying to pull your hip back away from your knee. So the shin doesn't move and we're going to pull the hip back away from it. Another common thing we'll see is people try and move from the knees first. They'll try and squat it. And what we'll see here is that the people have to move the bar away from their body to get around their knee. This means they're not hinging very much. You might get a little bit through the hamstring, but you're going to find an awkward position. It's going to shift more onto that lower back. So again, we want to make sure the shins stay vertical and he's pulling the hips back and keeping high. One more thing that we'll tend to see is people losing their upper back tension completely and just letting themselves round as they come down. Now, a couple of things with this. First off, there's going to be a losing tension through here. So as you spoke before, we want to be whatever cue works best for your client, whether that is protect your armpits, biceps to the front of the room, pretend somebody's ticking you, break the bar, whatever works, keep it in that position so they create as much tension through here as possible. Also, some people, just their structure is going to be a little bit rounded. We're not looking for what should be the perfect textbook deadlift. We want to make sure they can brace their spine and they can keep that position. So Kev here has got quite a good posture. If he comes into that position, his back's going to look a little bit more textbook flat. If we look at myself here, I'm a little bit more rounded through the upper back, but I'm still braced in that position. So it's just making sure there's no movement during the rep. That is the key thing. One other thing, you bring that bar down for me. The hip hinge itself is something that a lot of people struggle with. There are many drills to go through in this. We can look at the wall drill, we can look at various things. But what I quite like to teach people is the waiter's bow. So what I would get Kevin to do is he brings his hands up, almost like he's holding a tray, and I want him to imagine he's trying to bow to somebody without tipping the food on the floor. So if he comes back, here he has to hinge from the hips, so he doesn't tip the food on the floor. If he comes back up for me, if he leans forward, you'll see that this will now tip towards the floor, or if he sort of squats into it, he doesn't bow. So that's an easy way to teach clients how to hip hinge. One thing before we go into this is here what we'll often see is people elevating their toes to think it's going to allow them to shift more load back onto the hamstrings. The problem with this is actually we take away a lot of stability by doing this because you can't actually push his big toe into the ground effectively, and we actually might find that that problem we spoke about earlier with them falling over happens much quicker. So having a foot flat and creating that tension is going to be way better than having those toes elevated and losing stability, because if we lose stability, we lose the capability we have to put as much load on here as possible to challenge the muscles effectively.